Hey guys, welcome back to JD Mods. Back with another MR2 project video to do with the Gen 4 swap. This is one that I have a lot of requests to make, and when I was going to do the wiring for my car myself, I was really hoping to find more resources about it, so I thought I would make a video. If you guys are watching this, that means chances are it did work, so that's good news. So I'll try and take you guys along for the ride. It won't be necessarily a complete DIY. I'll try to make it as complete as possible. But whatever I don't include, I'll try and include some resources down below to link like the engine diagrams and whatever I'm using. So let's go ahead and get started wiring up this engine. First, I'll show you guys what I'm starting with. My engine is mechanically pretty much done, sitting in the engine bay all wired up. So of course it has the Gen 4 engine harness on it. The main differences with Gen 2 and Gen 4 being the coil on plug rather than the distributor, more modern sensors, a few other things like that. There's a map sensor rather than a MAF sensor, but those are probably the big ones. So I'm using the stock engine harness for this engine, of course, because it bolts right up, and then I have it going through the firewall. As you can see, I have removed some of the heat shielding from it to access the wires. And I guess we'll just dive right into what I've been doing. So here's the engine harness in the trunk area. I kind of disconnected a few separate things. The Caldina has an automatic ECU. This one did anyway. So there's this one conduit that jumps off of the harness that has a big gray plug like this and two little black plugs. And I've looked at diagrams and found out that these all have to do with the automatic ECU. I haven't cut them yet. I just kept them like this, and I'm putting them off to the side. We're not going to touch those. We might have to jump the neutral safety start switch. I'm not too sure. That's why I'm leaving it intact rather than cutting it and capping off all the wires. So I should mention that this harness and engine was already in a naturally aspirated MR2, but because I didn't do the wiring, I'm kind of looking everything over and learning as I go. So whether this is on the original harness or not is kind of irrelevant. But this is the EB1 plug. This is one of two plugs that will plug into your fuse box. Mine's in my engine bay. Some people move it to the trunk of the MR2. So in here you have the two connectors. I believe the small one's EB1 and the big one is something else. I don't want to quote it and get it wrong. I guess I'll leave that cover off for now. Okay, moving back over to the harness. I've labeled a few more wires. I have this big black wire here that goes to the starter relay. I have wired that. Unfortunately, this harness was quite damaged. It looks like it was like eaten by a dog or something. So a lot of the connectors are damaged, some are missing, but I'm working through it. This blue one is junction connector 8. It has some fuel pump, relay, resistor stuff, and a few signal wires from the throttle position sensor and stuff. I don't think I'm going to be doing too much with that. My harness has 3 junction blocks, it looks like, where they're all kind of tied together. Got 1, 2, and 3. They're all capped off. I'm leaving them like that. Again, this was running in an MR2, so I'm going to leave as much as I can, but I'm also redoing most of it, so sorry if that doesn't make sense. Okay, so here are the two main ECU connectors. So two of these, so the ECU has 4 plugs, 2 come from the engine harness, and the other 2 plugs, C and D, would have been like this and come from the Caldina body harness. But of course, I don't have the Caldina body harness, so I am missing the plugs, the 2 right plugs, the C and D plugs. I bought those plugs off of Drift Motion. They are a 24 and a 22 pin, I believe. You can also find them in Forerunners and stuff in junkyards as long as it's an OBD2 car around the model year 1999. But I bought them from Drift Motion as well as some wire pigtails, so hopefully those are in soon. If they don't arrive in time, I'm just going to kind of hardwire in the 10 pins. I think between these 2 plugs, there's about 10 pins that you actually use. Of course, I bought the connectors, but for troubleshooting, I don't think I need them. And then, I'm not sure if I'm missing a few connectors that were on here. but based on the color of the wires, I've labeled a few more. There's no point in me mentioning them right now. Instead, I'll just talk about them as we go along. You can see on my tape, I kind of have written to, and then which plug and which pin number. Before I get to the wiring, let's show you guys what else I have. I have a turbo, a Gen 2 MR2 turbo harness. We're going to be stealing some parts from this, such as the alternator cable. That's this double one that goes onto the fuse box. Sorry about the focus. There's also a 3-plug alternator connector that we will also be stealing from this harness as well. And I'm sure there's a few other things. There's a diagnostic box. For simplicity, I might not put this in for now. I don't think you need it. I also like the clean engine bay. But if I do want to put that in, I'm going to steal it from this harness. There's also just lots of wires, pins, spare connectors. I also have this mess. This is your fuel pump resistor, your injector resistor pack, and your fuel pump relay. I'm going to be deleting all of this, and I'll tell you how hopefully later in this video. I learned a few things about the fuel pump relay and resistor and why you can kind of bypass them. Lastly, on this workbench over here, I have a few kind of loose wiring connectors. So this one, I've labeled it. It came off my engine. This is the temp sender. The Caldina uses a different style temp sender, so we have to hardwire ours in. This is EA3. I think this is the other fuse box connector. I've already labeled a few wires that have to be connected on this one. This little guy here, EA1. This is the trunk connecting to the body harness in the trunk. This is the transmission speed sensor, something else we have to do. I am using a transmission with a cable speed sender for the dash, but there's also an electronic element. I'm not too sure what it does, but I know how to wire it, luckily. And this, of course, is your starter relay that goes in your trunk. Has 4 wires, 2 thick gauge wires, 2 thin wires for power, signal, ground. So those are all of our wires. Now we just have to connect them all up and make them work. What I'm starting with is getting all the lengths correct. So I plugged in the EB1 and EA3 fuse box connectors. And for me, the only one that is connected right now is the EB1. And so this was already done, but I'll mention it. So the 3 larger gauge wires on the top right, bottom right, and then one in, they're large gauge wires. And what the last owner of my harness did was splice them into a bunch of sensors. I think there's a couple sensors, probably like throttle position sensor and stuff on the engine that need power. I wish I could provide you guys with more detail on that. I don't think it matters where you get the power from. I believe there's a black with yellow stripe wire on this connector. There it is right there as well. Pin number 2, I believe. That was originally used to power a lot of sensors. As you can see, mine are cut. So I'm just going to leave it like it is now, and if something doesn't seem to be working, I can modify it later. Again, if you're seeing this video, chances are it's working. So the point of this was to get the lengths correct, because we have a bunch of wires on here to connect. And to come out of the fuse box, you kind of wire everything down this little track right here. And then there's a little cover that covers over that. Sorry about all this lighting. So now that I have my lengths correct, I can start connecting a bunch more wires. Made some good progress on the wiring harness. I actually off camera finished the entire fuse box. I preferred to do it that way off camera, learn about the wires myself, and then run through with you guys what each wire does and where it goes. So like I said before, the fuse box has 2 connectors. The big one here is called EA3, and the small one is EB1. So why don't we just go through one wire at a time, starting with EA3. So what I'll do is I'll point to each wire, show you where it goes, and I'm kind of reading off of this sheet at the same time. This is a little Excel sheet I found. I'll hopefully link this in the description as well. So the first white wire here, pin 1, is called TC, and it goes to pin C5 on the ECU and you can also tee it into the diagnostic box. That is for self-diagnostic. I don't think I need it. I'm not keeping the diagnostics box, so that's why mine is just cut short like that. Oh, my light went out, but that's okay. The next yellow wire is needed for ABS. I am not using that one either. The next one is black with white for me, and that is a ground. I believe this grounds the gauge cluster. I'm not sure if it is needed or like what it is used for. I think it is used for some stuff like the temperature gauge, cruise control, and speed sensor. The cruise control speed sensor. So I grounded that to the intake manifold. I ran a wire through the harness and then put a little stud right on the back of the intake manifold right here. Grounded it to the intake manifold. Next up, we have a yellow wire. That is the alternator charging light, position 2. So the alternator has a 3-wire plug. I showed you guys that earlier, the one I was going to be using. So the alternator is just under the intake there. And coming off of it are 3 wires. There's a yellow wire. I believe that was that yellow wire there. There's a black yellow stripe wire. And one more color that we'll talk about in a bit. And the alternator gets wired into these 2 plugs essentially. So this yellow wire, pin number 4, is position 2. And the colors are the same. So yellow goes to yellow. Black with yellow stripe goes black, yellow stripe. And the last one goes to the last one. All right. So the next pin looks like yellow with green stripe, pin 6. I missed one. Yes. Pin 5 is a black wire, hard to see on camera. That is your attack. So this goes to the ECU pin C27. All the ECU stuff, I just came down the harness, into the frunk, and then to the ECU plugs. I don't have those plugs right now, so they're just loose wires. But if you have the plugs, you just plug it into C27. That is how your attack shows the RPMs. And then, like I said, pin 6 is yellow with green wire. That is for your gauge coolant sensor temperature. So the normal Caldina temperature sensor wiring doesn't work for the gauge. So just straight up run a wire, yellow with green stripe, to the single wire coolant temp sensor right there on the coolant tree, right here. So just straight up wire from there to there, and that is how your temperature gauge works. The ECU gets its temperature, by the way, from the 3-pin sensor right back here. Sorry this is all over the place, guys. I'm not a wiring guy, so it takes me a second to explain everything. So I guess now we're on pin 7, which is this yellow with black stripe. This is for oil pressure. This will set off your oil pressure light on the dash when you get low oil pressure. So that goes to the oil pressure sender right there on the head. Same thing with the temperature sensor, just one wire straight into there. And then the last one on the top is a red wire with a white stripe. That is pin 8. And this is the starter signal to the ECU and the starter relay. So that wire gets run into the frunk. Here we are here. So run it into the frunk. And then on your starter relay, this green relay right here, there will be a red with white stripe. I can't remember what pin number that is. So it goes to there. And then also you wire it into the starter pin on the ECU. Which I forget what pin that is right now. Just looked it up. That goes to plug B, pin number 8. It's a black with white stripe wire. We're already on to the second row of this connector, and this one's pretty sparse, so don't worry. So the 2 which I'm missing pins for are for the VSV for AC idle up. Obviously, the Gen 4 uses an idle speed control valve located under the throttle body rather than a separate solenoid for when you turn on the AC. So those do not get used. That's why they are empty. Number 11 also does not get used. He is also empty. I don't even know what that one is. Number 12, this red with yellow stripe is for some airbag check. We're not using that one either. Okay, and then we have a red with black stripe, pin number 13, and this is the reverse light out. So I think this connects to your reverse light switch. So when you shift into reverse, it puts on the reverse lights. And so that goes to a sensor on your transmission. It is a 2-wire sensor. I literally just plugged it in. Why am I having such a hard time finding it? A mosquito is biting my arm as I'm talking to you guys right now, which is not helping. I am so sorry that I cannot find it. There it is right there. So that 2-wire switch, one of the wires is same color, red with black stripe, and that goes to that pin number, what did I say, 13, right there. Okay, so then we have these brown and yellow wires. They kind of go together. They are for the intake air temperature sensor. I think there's 2 intake air temperature sensors. There's one on the manifold right here. And there's one that must be at the front of the car because these 2, I think, are intake temperature sensor, ground, and power. I think the brown is ground, which I've kind of concluded lots of brown wires are earths, and the yellow is the power. And so those go to, the brown goes to a junction connector with lots of brown wires on the Caldina harness, and the yellow goes to pin B22 on the ECU. So those get run into the frunk, and then B22 for the yellow wire. And here is the junction connector. Has just a bunch of brown wires coming off the back with a plug on the end, and the plug has a bunch of metal pins, so every wire on this connector, look at that mosquito, about to bite me. Every wire on this connector is connected together, so this is like a big junction connector for grounds. Pin 16, this black wire is for AC. I have AC but haven't wired it up yet, so we're not going to use that. That's to engage the AC clutch. This white with red is that last alternator wire I was talking about. So that is alternator regulator position 1. So that just goes straight into the triple plug on your alternator. Then this pink wire here is something that's used on the Gen 4. It's the idle throttle plate close signal. Something on the Gen 2 that uses it, but the Gen 4 doesn't, so it is blocked off. Wow, that was painful. To be fair, it was also a little painful to wire, but that is the busiest connector on the entire swap, so we got it out of the way. Let's talk now about connector EB1. Again, I'm looking at this diagram here. So let me go through and show you guys which one I connected. There isn't too many. So this is something we talked about a little bit earlier. There's these 3 fatter wires, thicker gauge wires. So they are actually, I've learned, power wires from the ignition relay, I believe. So pin number 1, this top one here, goes to the cooling fan motor. I haven't done much with that. It was already wired in on mine. And I'm going to be running constant power to the cooling fan. That's, of course, the fan on your intercooler. I'm going to be running constant power for that one. So I'm not using the cooling fan ECU, which saves me a lot of wires. Then directly below that is pin 4. And it comes from the ignition relay. You can see there's tons of wires coming out of there. And that splits up for stuff like the check connector plus B terminal, idle speed control valve plus B, and power in for the igniter, injectors, and ignition coil. I'm pretty sure it's quite easy to tee this into the harness. Pretty much any black wire with red stripe from the Caldina harness that powers a sensor off of the ignition circuit. You tee into these. I confirmed mine is correct by doing a continuity test between this and all the positive terminals on my coil packs, for example, and any sensor that would have power from the ignition circuit. You can see here it says injectors, igniter, and ignition coil. And you connect it to BF1-3 and coils. So I confirm my coils, not my injectors yet. They're really hard to get to. And the last wire on the EB1 connector is the black with yellow wire. That's the last one we're going to worry about. That's pin number 7, and that goes to the alternator position 3. And the other wire on the reverse light switch that we were talking about earlier just gets teed into this as well. Also, if your car has cruise control, I just read that the speed sensor for cruise control will also have a black wire with a yellow stripe. It gets teed into here as well. And also the fan controller power in. So this is clearly a power wire for those type of sensors. The last thing in the fuse box is this big wire with the cover, and that is just gets bolted down there. And just like the Gen 2, that just goes to your alternator. That is the main alternator battery charging cable. And that is everything we are touching in the fuse box. The next thing I wired was the starter. There's only 4 wires, and we already talked about the red with white stripe one, so there's only 3 wires left. Wasn't that hard at all. The thick gauge black wire, I don't have the numbers for the pinouts because I don't have a diagram for this on me right now, but the thick black wire goes to the solenoid on the starter. It's just a single wire connector. Plugs in right over here on the starter. And then on the starter is also a stud for the power. And so that stud, of course, goes to your chassis harness. I think that comes from the battery. And then also off of that comes a little eyelet on the thick gauge white wire. I put it through some conduit right here. I'm going to tie it up all nice, probably to this engine mount, and then tie it into the harness. There it is right there. Comes through the harness, and that's the thick gauge white wire. So thick gauge white wire goes to the stud. Thick gauge black wire goes to the solenoid. The red with white stripe goes to the fuse box. We already talked about that one, and ties into the ECU as well. And then the white with black stripe is the final wire, and that goes to the plug coming out of your firewall right here called EA1, and it goes to pin 7, of course, white with black stripe. So now that I have that length established, I'm going to go ahead and tackle some of the other wires coming out of EA1. Okay, I just realized how simple this plug is. We're pretty much done already. So first, the ones we're not using. Pins, so we connected pin 7 to the starter. So pin 8's not used. Pin 9 is for VF1 on your check connector that plug in the engine bay. I've deleted that, so we're not using this. And then pin 10 is a purple wire, which goes to your speed sensor on the transmission for cruise control. This is the one with the triangular plug right here. One of them is a purple wire. The male side of the plug, of course, I don't have it because I'm not using cruise control. But if you did, there'd be a purple wire coming off of that, and that would go there for your cruise control. The wire we are using is EA1 pin 2. It is red with green stripe. The wiring diagram says green with red stripe, but anyway. It goes to ECU pin D3. So this wire comes from the circuit opening relay. That's the relay that turns on when you turn your ignition on. And so this is going to ECU plug D pin number 3, and that is pin FC for the fuel pump. So that communicates with the ECU on when to trigger the fuel pump. I'm waiting on my pin C and D in the mail, so we're going to just leave this floating right here. And let's go ahead and talk about the rest of the fuel system. It's now time to talk about the fuel pump system and how that works. So we just talked about sending the signals to the ECU. There's another one coming from the last plug we haven't touched, E6A, but we'll get there when we get there. That's just sending power to the ECU. I don't know how much that has to do with the fuel pump. So back to the fuel pump. We have the signal that we talked about going to D3 or D2 from here. And then in the engine bay is where we do most of the fuel pump wiring itself. So there used to be this mess of stuff here bolted onto the firewall. And so this here is the fuel pump resistor. You got your injector resistor pack and your fuel pump relay. So you don't need the injector resistor pack because this one uses the different impedance injectors, either high or low, I can't remember. We don't need the fuel pump resistor. I did some research and we just don't need it. And the fuel pump relay is not to switch on and off the fuel pump. It's because the Gen 2's fuel rail wasn't the greatest. So they actually had high speed and low speed. So this would switch between running the power through the resistor and straight from the circuit opening relay to the pump. So the resistor was used to slow down the fuel pump, which is why we don't need it. So we're deleting the resistor and bypassing the relay. And in doing so, we get rid of this big mess out of the engine bay. Let's just go ahead and put this over there, never to be touched again. And so the two plugs that go into that, you can find them under your fuse box. I've unbolted mine for ease of access. Here's the two connectors. So you got fuel pump relay, fuel pump resistor. So we're deleting this and this. And a lot of these wires are tied in together because there's 6 plugs total on the end of this. And coming out of the main harness, there's only 4. There's 3 of the same color. There's 2 large gauge wires that are blue with black stripe. Then there's 1 small blue with black stripe and 1 small blue with red stripe. The diagram's on my phone, so I can't film it, so I tried to draw something up here. So from the circuit opening relay, there's a blue with black stripe that sends it normally to the fuel pump relay. And then off the fuel pump relay, there's a blue and white that goes through the resistor, back to a blue and black to the motor. And also from the relay, there's a straight wire, blue and black, straight to the motor. So these 2 wires, the blue and blacks, are tied together, which is why you see 3, not 4, if I'm counting correctly. So, but what I'm going to do, I'm assuming that without undoing my whole harness, I don't know which one's which, but I'm assuming the larger gauge one is the one that carries the full current. So I'm just going to cut all 4 of those wires, attach the blue and blacks together, and cap off the blue and white and blue and red. I guess I forgot to mention, but the blue and red wire is the one that would normally go to your ECU to flip-flop it back and forth between high pressure and low pressure. If you do keep this, there is a pin on the Gen 4 ECU, but I'm not keeping it. That's what mine ended up looking like. Two big blue with black stripe wires soldered together. And then the 2 small ones, I just did some heat shrink. Now I'm just going to tape it all up, put it up against this harness, put the fuse box in, all done. Good news, my connectors for the ECU just came in the mail. I got these from Drift Motion. These are the connectors you need for pin or ECU C and D plugs. I think this one, let me check the wiring diagram to know how many pins they were. I have forgotten. I don't have these because I'm assuming they were kept on the Caldina donor car rather than cut off for the swap. So I'm assuming this is a common thing that'll happen to people. So we just got ECU plug C, which is a 28 pin, and D, which is a 22 pin. So now we can go ahead and connect up the last plug, which is E6A, this dark gray plug right here. E6A, and this has quite a few that go to plug C and D on the ECU. We already had a few that we already talked about that will be going there right here. So I'm going to see if I can connect a bunch of them up and explain what I did. I just finished off the last connector. So I realized that EA6 goes into the ECU of the old Gen 2. So I don't have the female plug for that, so I had to just cut it off and use the wires I needed from it. It looks like I needed about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's about 7 wires you run off of it. I just did exactly as the sheet says, so let me just run through the sheet. So here it is, E6A. So the pin number 1 is white with a red stripe, and it's the battery, and it goes to D1, and that is all the time battery. Remember, C and D are the ECU. Most of these go to C and D. Number 2, ELS, goes to D19, not sure what that is. Nothing for 3. 4 and 5 are both green and white, so make sure to do this before you cut it. Unlike I did, I had to like do some inspection on the cuts of the wires to know which one was which. So pin 4 is stop brake switch signal, goes to C6. Pin 5 is the check engine light, that goes to D6. Pin 6, blue red stripe, is for the trigger for the fuel pump relay for the high and low speeds. I deleted all that, so I'm not doing anything with that. Don't do anything with 7. Number 8, you don't do anything with, I don't think. I don't have ABS hooked up, so I don't worry about it right now. Number 9 is the speed from the gauge cluster, goes to C22. 10 is AC signal, that goes to C25. So this is the starter signal to ECU. And they say to do pin 11 to B8, but I didn't do that. I just used this one right here off the starter that we talked about earlier. So that's already going to B8, so I didn't bother doing it again. And spoiler alert, it's working fine. I already tested it. Number 12 and 13 are both power, like ignition switch power. They're both black and yellow. And I ended up just using one of them to pin D16. And a junction connector number 3 as well needs it. But I think we already got power from that for something else. Sorry, this video is filmed over a bunch of days. So yeah, you need to send power to junction connector number 3. I can't remember if I used this one or the one from the fuse box in the engine bay. And then D16 is very important. That's to give the ECU power. And the last 2 are for power steering, which we're not doing. So that is actually all of the wires hooked up. Now I did make a few mistakes in this video so far, so I will run over them now. So in the engine bay here, you remember there was these 3 large gauge black with red striped wires. These are ignition power. Don't remember where they come from. I think it might be the EFI system, but anyway, you can only use the left 2. You can see this one here I was using before, but you cannot do that because if you pull out the plug, actually I won't, it's kind of tight in there. There's no pin on the other side of that. So maybe the NA ones or some MR2s have that, but the turbo ones definitely do not. So my problem was my injectors weren't getting any constant power. So that's where this comes from. This goes to one of the junction connectors, maybe 3 or 4 or 6, one of those junction connectors to give all the power to the injectors. And you have to make sure to tie that into the left 2. Don't do anything with this plug because there's actually nothing there. Everything else in the fuse box we already talked about is okay. Speaking of junction connectors, in the front here, we had this blue connector that I did not think we needed to do anything with. This is called junction connector 8, but we definitely do. It should have one of these lids. Mine doesn't. If yours does, great. Don't listen to me anymore. But if it doesn't, you need to cut the yellow and light green wires and connect them together like you see here. And there's also 3 blue wires going to the junction connector. You need to connect them up as well. This is for your throttle position sensor to get 5 volts, and this is for your cam and crank sensors. My first starts, I didn't have these done, and it didn't even crank. Had fuel, spark, didn't even pop. So these are obviously very important. Aside from that, like I said, I did some testing off camera already, and it is popping. Also, here's a little preview of a few more panels on my car. Like I said, this video is quite spaced out. So let's go ahead, set up the camera, and see if it starts. So as you saw, the car starts and idles decently well. This motor also hasn't been in a car for quite a long time. This did remind me of one more thing I can quickly talk about. I did throw a check engine light, and once about 30 seconds passes, the idle goes up and down. I think it's idle air control valve, O2 sensor, something in the closed loop circuit that's messing up. And so I thought I could talk about quickly how you can install one of these OBD2 ports for your new Gen 4 OBD2 engine. Here's a little wiring diagram for a standard OBD2 port. You can get one of these from the junkyard online. So counting from the top, over pin 4 and 5, those two gray ones there are ground. Just ground those to the chassis or wherever you like. Pin 7, the yellow one right here, I guess, would be signal, and that's ECU pin D11. Then the only other one you need to do is the last pin, the red one, 16, is 12 volts positive, and that can be connected to pin D16 or any other positive voltage source. Then to read this, you need to get a O2 sensor that has JOBD2, or one of the Bluetooth apps that can do Japanese ECUs. It's a little different than regular OBD2. It'll plug in and everything, but it won't read. So I can't do that in today's video because my scanner's not here with me. I do have one, but it's not here with me. But now at least you know how to do it. Another mistake I made was here in the engine bay. So as you know, the harness has lots of junction connectors. You can see some here, one back here. And if you don't know what these are, basically they're just like little ports for a bunch of wires to be teed together. On this one, I believe like all the blue ones are teed together, and these ones over here are teed together. It's just based on what this connector internals look like. And this wouldn't be a problem for most people, but it looks like my junction connector 8, this blue one, got bit by a dog or something. So I'm missing the cap for it. Didn't really think much about it. But that should have one of these caps that connect various wires together. So that was one of the reasons why it would start and die right away, because these 3 wires, the green with red stripe, yellow, and gray, are supposed to get teed together, because that's your power for your map sensor, intake air temperature, and throttle body position sensor, I believe. So I teed all those together, tied them together, as well as over here, there are 3 small gauge blue wires. 1, 2, 3. You can see them in a line right there, so you have to tee those in together as well. And those are for, I believe, your crank and cam position sensor power. And then these last 3 here are all blue with red stripe. That's for your fuel pump resistor, which I'm not using, so I obviously didn't even bother teeing them together, but that's what they should be doing. This wouldn't be an issue if you did have this connector, but I guess that should be a note. If you're missing any of these caps, there will be serious issues, so make sure you have all the caps. If not, you can tee them together like I did with this one. While we're back here, I'll mention a few other things I learned and that we can talk about. As you can see, I wired up the OBD2 as I showed you guys, and I actually went ahead and ordered this BAFX or BAFX OBD2 port. This was off of Amazon for like $50 Canadian. Plugs right in there. And then I downloaded the Torque Pro app for $5, inputted a custom string. You can find it online, and it works really well for reading codes, live streaming data, stuff like that. So that was the OBD2 port. And another thing I'll mention is I deleted the engine bay fan because I'm going to be running it all the time. So there's a module in here that controls the engine bay fan when it turns on based on the engine bay's temperature. But I want to run it all the time. So what I did is grabbed power from this EA6 connector, black with yellow stripe. It's actually the same power I'm using to run my OBD2 port. I just extended a wire up, over, down, through a grommet in the engine bay, up here, and over to my fan, and then the other wire from the fan is just grounded right up there. So now my fan turns on every time the ignition switch is in the on mode. So the one other thing I'll mention is that the Gen 4 engine has no low oil level sensor, and the oil pan, it only has an oil pressure light. So if you don't do anything about it, on your gauge you will get a light come up for low oil level. It's not a big deal, but I don't like lights, so to fix that you go behind this panel right here. You just unclip this one, and kind of right behind the speaker, you can see the speaker holes there. I'm not going to take my interior apart, but right about on the other side of this panel right here, there's a little blue box, and that is your your oil level ECU, and it has a 6-pin connector going to it. And I believe pin number 6, it is a red wire. Just ground that on the harness side, so you want to leave it plugged in. Then cut the wire, because that's the wire that goes to the Gen 2 sensor, and ground out that wire, and that tricks the ECU to thinking the sensor is working, and the light will go off. Well, if you can't tell, my car is outside now. It's actually under a cover because it was just raining. But it's been a few days since I started this video in my garage, and since then the MR2 has been running and driving, so I know everything's working well. It has a little idle issue with the idle hunting, and it had one misfire issue, but only a few minor things to work out, so I'm pretty happy with how the wiring turned out. Hopefully this is helpful to some guys. It's definitely still a lot easier to get done by someone else, but if you don't have the time or you want to save a few dollars, hopefully this helped you guys do it yourself. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more MR2 content.